Tennessee, 1863. The war was raging, the world was burning, and while Union and Confederate forces spilled blood above ground, beneath the cypress trees of Cotton Hollow, another kind of war was quietly being waged. A quieter genocide. One that didn't end when the cannons stopped. One that birthed a dynasty soaked in profit, privilege, and shadow. The Chamberlain family didn't build their empire with cotton alone. No. That's the lie they printed in ledgers and carved into polished gravestones. The truth was far more brutal and far more profitable. 73 lives, men, women, and even children, worked that cursed field under conditions no war story ever told. Because they didn't matter. They weren't soldiers. They weren't landowners. They were disposable currency. And when they fell, their bodies were dumped into pits, unmarked and unnamed, like weeds pulled from the earth. But here's what they never expected: some truths don't die in silence. Some graves don't stay buried. You see, the Chamberlains weren't just another Southern family trying to survive the Civil War. They were something else. Something older. They'd been there before the states were united. Before the land was even mapped. Whispers say their fortune wasn't just from cotton. It came from a pact. A blood pact, land that would grow crops unnaturally fast, laborers who worked without question, and secrets buried in cycles. Every decade someone vanished, a worker, a tenant, a child, always alone, always quiet, always forgotten, until a traveling preacher in 1904 uncovered one of the burial sites, 73 skulls, all facing downward, teeth shattered as if they'd died screaming into the dirt. The preacher vanished a week later. No newspaper covered it, no police file was opened, because the Chamberlains weren't just rich. They were connected. Judges, bankers, generals, all on their payroll, all complicit. But this story isn't about them. It's about you. Because if you're watching this, you've just found the first crack in a forgotten wall. And behind it isn't just history. It's the blueprint of control that never ended. One that still lives, still breathes, still rules. And you're about to learn what it costs to wake up in a world built on the bones of the silenced. Shall we keep going? The Chamberlains understood something primal, something most men still refuse to see. Power isn't taken. It's engineered. And while others fought over flags and borders, they were designing a legacy built on obedience, memory erasure, and psychological fracture. You have to understand they didn't just want land. They wanted minds. It began with isolation. Cotton Hollow was deliberately chosen, not just for the soil but for its silence. Dense forests, no nearby towns, one road in, none marked out. Workers were brought in but not documented. No contracts, no family names. Just bodies, cheap, invisible labor fed into a machine that never stopped spinning. And what happened next wasn't slavery, it was something deeper. More methodical. They stripped the workers of time. No clocks, no calendars, just sunlight, bell chimes, and command. When you don't know what day it is, you forget who you are. When you're denied language, forced to speak only when told, punished for using your own, you become hollow. That's what they created: hollow humans. Not just broken backs, but broken identities. Sound familiar? It should. Because these methods, these psychological controls, they didn't die in the fields, they were refined, perfected, turned into models. Used in schools, prisons, corporations, even churches. Everything the Chamberlains learned in those fields was passed on, quietly, through foundations, philanthropy, scholarships, and it worked. It still works. Look around. The modern world is filled with men who don't know what day it is emotionally. Disconnected. Numb, grinding for someone else's profit. Quiet, compliant, hollow. Because this wasn't just about physical slavery. It was generational mind control. See, the Chamberlains didn't fear revolt. They feared memory. That one day someone would put the bones back together. Draw the map backward from power to its blood-soaked roots. That's why they scrubbed every document, bribed every historian, and ensured no child born in Cotton Hollow would ever learn their real name. But memory always leaks, and the land always remembers. So when a team of surveyors discovered strange electromagnetic pulses in the soil beneath the Chamberlain estate in 1993, everything shifted. The ground beneath the main house, once a manor, was buzzing. Literally. Devices died, footage warped, and a strange pattern emerged under the floorboards, burned into the stone. A sigil, old, not European, not native, older. That's when the real fear began. Because the Chamberlains weren't just hiding bodies. They were guarding a technology of control, spiritual, psychological, and psychic. And you're just beginning to understand how deep this goes. They called it the Seal of Breathless Dominion, a crude name given by the only surviving member of the 1993 survey team who dared speak. He was found 6 months later in a motel just outside Knoxville, scrawling the same pattern over and over on the walls in charcoal and blood. When questioned, he muttered the same phrase until he passed out from dehydration. It listens through the soil. The symbol they found wasn't just carved into stone. It was humming. Alive, not metaphorically, electrically. Embedded with what one physicist called a non-terrestrial frequency. Low, resonant, barely detectable. But when amplified, it had side effects: nausea, disorientation, auditory hallucinations. But here's what the authorities won't tell you. This frequency matches something recorded in deep sea trenches near Mariana and near Antarctica's buried meteorite fields. And, most disturbingly, beneath every known mass grave left unmarked since the 1600s. This isn't coincidence. This is architecture. A map of control encrypted in vibration, buried in blood. The Chamberlains didn't discover it. They were taught, initiated, handed something ancient, something powerful. And their plantation was more than a cotton field. It was a test site, a broadcast tower disguised as a farm. And it worked. Workers would become docile within days, compliant. The moment they crossed onto Chamberlain soil, they stopped resisting. They labored until collapse, smiled through pain. And when they died, they weren't mourned, they were used. Because beneath the house, they didn't just find bodies. They found arrangement. Skulls placed in concentric circles, femurs stacked like pylons. Bones tuned and positioned like the ribs of an ancient machine. This wasn't burial. It was ritual installation. Human remains as signal amplifiers. The soil had memory because it had a transmitter. A field of death engineered to send out obedience like smoke from a chimney. Now here's where it gets darker. In 2002, a nonprofit purchased the land, intending to build a museum of Southern history. Within 2 months, all 4 board members had resigned. One lost his speech entirely. Another fled to Iceland. The files were sealed, the project buried. Why? Because they saw the blueprints. And so will you. In a few moments, I'm going to ask you to comment something. Not for the algorithm, for your identity, for anchoring yourself as one of the few who still feel beneath the numbness. But not yet. Because once you know the truth behind the Chamberlain sigil, what it unlocks, what it feeds, you can't go back. And once we cross that threshold, your mind will never be yours again. Unless you learn to fight for it. The Chamberlain sigil wasn't designed for decoration. It was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt, in the marrow, in the dreams, in the subconscious territories of the human mind that language can't reach, but symbols, ancient symbols, invade. When the soil beneath the house was disturbed, strange reports surfaced within days. Locals began sleepwalking toward the estate. Dogs howled facing underground. Old men who'd lived their whole lives near Cotton Hollow began to describe recurring dreams of a black mouth in the earth, breathing in silence, swallowing voices. One man, Ezekiel Harp, a gravedigger's son, claimed he saw his deceased father standing at the edge of the forest near the old cotton fields. Mouth open, eyes white, pointing at the ground. Harp was institutionalized that week. Before being sedated, he scratched a phrase into his skin with a key. The bones are listening. You need to understand. This isn't ghost story nonsense. This is psychological warfare wrapped in folklore. It's how they hide the truth. They don't erase it, they dress it in madness. In fiction. So when the truth leaks through, the world dismisses it as the rantings of the disturbed. But it's real. It always was. The Chamberlains weren't just landowners. They were curators. Gatekeepers of an inheritance that didn't belong to this country, or even this era. The sigil's design matches similar emblems carved into obsidian slabs unearthed in Guatemala, Malta, and beneath the Dead Sea. It's pre-language, pre-civilization, older than what we dare call human. What does it do? It triggers emotional submission. The moment it's seen, fully seen, by the subconscious, the mind begins to bend. Authority becomes comfort. Control feels like safety. Disobedience tastes like death. You become your own warden. Sound familiar? Because this sigil, or versions of it, are everywhere now. Embedded in logos, fashion, architectural layouts, military patches. They've been stylized, digitized, masked in minimalism. But the resonance is intact. They don't need to make you believe it. They only need to make you see it, again and again, until the shape owns a piece of your mind. And here you are, looking at it, hearing it, feeling that chill down your spine, that stillness in your chest. Good? That means you're not hollow yet. Now, I want you to pause, go to the comments, and type the phrase, "I hear what the bones remember," twice, not just for the algorithm, but for you, to mark your mind as one that won't be taken silently. Once you do, we'll go deeper. You type the phrase, you cross the line. And now we go where most men flinch, where most turn back. What happened on Chamberlain land was not an isolated case. It was a template, A dark prototype for something far more ambitious. Something global. What they tested in silence, others refined in the open, under the camouflage of progress, prosperity, and public service? Let me show you. After the Civil War ended, while the South lay in ruin, the Chamberlains didn't retreat. They expanded. Their holdings spread quietly west to Arkansas, north to Kentucky, and eventually to D.C. But it wasn't just land they acquired. It was influence. 3 of their descendants entered government. 2 became high-ranking clergy. 1 embedded himself in the psychiatric field, Dr. Franklin M. Chamberlain, father of the controversial mind alignment therapy technique used on war veterans from 1918 to 1947. The therapy was lauded until men started killing themselves mid-session, scribbling symbols on walls and speaking in tongues. Sound paranoid, let me sharpen the blade. In 1939, a Chamberlain-owned construction company won the contract to rebuild Site R, a shadow government facility dug beneath Raven Rock Mountain. Few know this, but before it became a Cold War command center, Raven Rock was an indigenous sacred site. The Susquehannock people spoke of a second breath that emerged from beneath that mountain, an intelligence not of flesh, but of earth, thought. Not a god, not a demon, something worse, neutral power. The Chamberlains built over it, because that's what they do. They build monuments over memory, silence over screams. They cloak control in concrete, wrap ritual in bureaucracy, and call it stability. But beneath those structures, beneath every dam, every fortress, every stadium and obelisk, there are echoes, bones, sigils, arrangements. You felt it. That strange unease inside airports, courthouses, megachurches, that sudden drop in temperature in certain museums, the hum behind the silence in hospitals. You felt it because it's real. The Chamberlain design wasn't just about land ownership, it was about territorial imprinting, psychic mapping, making a place obedient to a frequency. When you enter, you're not just standing in a room, you're standing inside a mechanism, and you are part of its function. Still think this is just history? No, you live in their cathedral, you work in it, worship in it, you even pay to enter. But now that you see it, you will start noticing what no one else can. Now we enter the cathedral of silence, but not the kind made of stone and stained glass, the one made of systems, built with policies, reinforced through media, whispered into your skull by things you mistake for your own thoughts. Let me ask you a question. Why do you feel exhausted, even when you haven't done anything wrong? Why do you censor yourself before anyone else does it for you? Why do you feel watched when no one's in the room? Because you're inside it. The echo chamber the Chamberlains helped build. You see, after their land-based experiments proved successful, the Chamberlain Dynasty shifted to something more enduring: institutional engineering. They funded behavioral research programs under fake foundations, built learning centers across the South. But behind every noble facade, there was one goal: to program compliance from cradle to coffin. They knew physical chains break, but psychological cages, they rebuild themselves. From the 1940s through the 1980s, Chamberlain-owned trusts quietly poured money into curriculum development programs, standardized testing, and media literacy campaigns. Think about that word for a moment: literacy. They weren't trying to make you smarter. They were teaching your brain what to ignore, what not to feel, what not to question. Everything was designed to flatten the inner world of man. Curiosity became danger, stillness became laziness, anger became mental illness, and worst of all, obedience became virtue. But it didn't stop there. Through partnerships with emerging pharmaceutical companies, the Chamberlain descendants championed the first wave of mood stabilization drugs, pitched not to the suffering, but to the restless, the wild, the intuitive, the men who felt too much. They weren't healing trauma. They were sanding down the edges of the warrior. Do you see the pattern now? The same principles tested in the cotton fields, silence, confusion, dissociation, became pillars of modern civilization. But now, they didn't need the whip. They used architecture, screens, algorithms, HR departments. A man doesn't need a cage when he's afraid of his own freedom. And while the world ran faster, louder, brighter, they dimmed the signal inside of you. They made you forget your instincts, doubt your gut, fear your own reflection. But that's why you're here. Because you've started remembering. And once that door opens, once that ancient signal in your blood starts humming again, they can't close it. Not without breaking you entirely. We're only getting started. The most dangerous prisons have no bars, no locks, no guards, just a belief system, built so deep inside your mind. You defend it like your own skin. That's the final phase of the Chamberlain design. Not just to rule over you, but to make you rule over yourself. Let's go back, briefly, to 1863. 73 men, women, and children worked that cursed field. Starved, controlled, psychologically dismantled. But one among them resisted, not with violence but with memory. An elderly woman named Amma, brought from coastal Georgia. She'd seen this before. On another plantation, another house, another sigil, she whispered to the others in a language long lost to colonial dictionaries. She drew counter symbols in the dirt. She refused the rations given, refused the water. She drank only from the stream off property. She sang old songs at night, tones that disrupted the sleeping rhythms of the Chamberlain house. And within a month, 4 white men were dead. No wounds, no illness, just gone. Hearts stopped, mouths open, eyes burned black. The Chamberlains called it an uprising. They burned her alive in front of the others. But Amma didn't scream. She smiled. Because she knew something they couldn't comprehend. You cannot enslave what remembers itself. She was the fracture in their system, the virus in their matrix, a living reminder that the true war was not fought with chains and bullets, but with consciousness. Fast forward to now. They've replaced the overseer's whip with performance reviews, the plantation bell with notifications, the confinement shacks with cubicles, screens, and streaming sedatives. And you think you're free because no one's chasing you. But tell me this, why do you still feel hunted? Why does part of you shut down in crowds? Why does silence scare you more than noise? Because your instincts are still online. Your body remembers what your mind was programmed to forget. You are not broken. You are interfered with. Every time you doubt your gut, question your value, stay silent when you know truth. That's the Chamberlain design at work. Not the family, not the name, but the system they help plant in the soil of your psyche. And now you have a choice. You either keep walking through this mirror, shattering lie after lie until the air tastes sharp again, or you turn back. But if you're still here, you've already chosen. You're still here. That means something inside you won't bow. Not to history, not to fear, not even to the program running inside your own thoughts. Now let's talk about the harvest, because you see, the Chamberlains didn't just want obedience. They didn't just want labor. They wanted something far more valuable, something extractable, not oil, not cotton, but energy, emotional, psychic, biological. Let me explain. Modern science barely touches this, but ancient systems knew it well. Human beings emit electromagnetic resonance when they're under extreme states of emotion, especially suffering. And this suffering, when structured, when ritualized, creates something darkly potent, something harvestable. The Chamberlains knew this. They didn't just work their laborers to death. They orchestrated a frequency of despair. They fed that field with synchronized agony, broken spirits, terrified minds, repetitive trauma, always at the same time, always in cycles, and beneath that the sigil, always active, always receiving. That's why they called the property the hollow, not because it was empty, because it was a vessel. When the bones were uncovered, some were coated in a strange black residue, high in iron, but biologically untraceable. Forensic teams said the marrow had crystallized unnaturally, as if the body's life force had been vacuumed before death. But we've seen this before, haven't we? In medieval torture chambers built in concentric circles, in the starvation pits of ancient empires, in child labor factories that seem to survive every regime change. The question isn't why this happens. The question is who's collecting. Because if you think these systems exist for money, you're still at the surface. The Chamberlains weren't greedy. They were disciples, operating under a greater architecture. Their rituals, their punishments, their field placements, it all matched patterns found in ancient temples. And those temples were never houses of worship, they were batteries, built to charge something that doesn't bleed. Something that waits. Something that feeds. And it still does. Just now through different means: digital anguish, social polarization, algorithmic despair. When millions scream in chaos, someone something harvests the frequency. Why do you think trauma trends are monetized? Why does outrage get pushed? Why is stillness clarity and masculine control constantly mocked? Because your silence isn't profitable. Your wholeness isn't useful. But your brokenness, that's currency. The Chamberlains were just the farmers. Now tell me, they didn't need you to die. They needed you to suffer consistently, predictably, in rhythms they could measure and refine. That's the darkest part. The system doesn't want you dead. It wants you drained, slowly, steadily, silently, until you're too numb to notice what's been stolen. And it all began with ritualized despair. The Chamberlains understood that suffering, when patterned, becomes music to the unseen. A psychic chorus, echoing through fields, churches, hospitals, prisons, even boardrooms. Have you ever walked into a room that made your stomach turn, Even though nothing was wrong. That wasn't intuition. That was memory. Ancestral memory. You are the product of generations who've lived inside these harvesting grids, unknowing participants in an energy economy that doesn't appear on any stock exchange. Your bloodline wasn't just shaped by hardship, it was extracted from. And the harvesters, they left no fingerprints, only blueprints? Let's be clear. The Chamberlains didn't invent this, they were initiates. The sigil they embedded beneath the floorboards. It matches geometric patterns found in the Nada Playa stone circles in Egypt, in the Jew Bakley tip columns of Turkey, in the forbidden diagrams stolen from the Library of Alexandria before it burned. The same angles, the same design, always hidden under the feet of the desperate. Always pulsing, always active. That's why you feel it, this quiet war humming beneath your skin. Why you can't sleep. Why you wake up with teeth clenched and dreams you can't remember. You are standing in the aftershock of a 1,000-year ritual, and they want you to stay asleep. Because when you wake up, fully, you disrupt the current. You become a break in the grid, a short circuit in their cathedral. You become dangerous, and that's why they mock men like you. That's why truth is labeled toxic, why power is pathologized, why masculinity is diluted and spoon-fed back to you as shame. Because if you ever reclaim the signal, if enough of you remember what it means to stand without asking, the machine starves, and the echo of Amma's voice returns. You cannot enslave what remembers itself. You're remembering now, aren't you? Let's keep going. You're not just remembering, you're awakening. And with every truth that pierces your comfort, a new part of you comes online. An ancient instinct, older than language, that was buried under layers of fear, conformity, and controlled history. But here's the catch, they planned for this. They knew men like you would eventually start to stir, that some would slip through the cracks. So they built a second layer, a deeper cage, one made not of silence, but noise. Let me explain. The Chamberlains learned, over generations, that when silence fails to suppress a man, overstimulation will. If you can't numb him with absence, drown him in distraction. That's what the modern world is. Not progress, but containment. You wake up to an alarm. Your first action is to reach for a screen. Before you've remembered who you are, you're being fed who you should be. Every scroll, every click, every ad, every outrage cycle, it's all calibrated. Not just to steal time, to fracture coherence. To make sure your mind never aligns long enough to become dangerous again. Because alignment is power, stillness is signal, and they've made both extinct. The very geometry of your environment was designed to suppress signal amplification. Cubicles, rectangular architecture, flickering blue light screens, constant background noise. Why do you think the most successful environments feel cold, sterile, inhuman? It's by design. It's a continuation of the Chamberlain field, just digitized, industrialized, globalized. And here's the deepest irony: you are the generator. Your thoughts, your pain, your memories, your instincts. You are the source of the current they built this empire on. But you've been tricked into believing you're powerless. They've handed you dopamine in exchange for discipline, entertainment in exchange for instinct, and convenience in exchange for consciousness. But there's one thing they can't simulate, can't bottle, can't algorithmically recreate: the moment a man remembers who he is, without permission. That's the fracture point. That's the crack in the cathedral wall. And if you're still here, you're standing in it. Now the question is, will you step through? Step through, and the air changes. Reality doesn't bend, it reveals. Because what you've called normal life is a well-dressed hallucination. A set, a stage, a ritual, built to keep men obedient and forgetful. But the second you begin to observe it, really observe it, it collapses. You start to see the patterns. Why every public tragedy is followed by a flood of noise. Why every rebellion is absorbed, pacified, branded, and sold back to you as a movement. Why the same elite bloodlines, disguised behind philanthropy, progress, and protection, always emerge untouched after every collapse they cause. Because there are no coincidences, only patterns, only designs. The Chamberlains didn't survive centuries of upheaval by accident. They mastered the art of controlled destruction, and that's what this entire system is: a loop. Collapse, rebuild, profit, control, collapse, rebuild, profit, control. It's not failure, it's harvest season. When the field stops producing obedience, they burn it, blame you, then offer to rebuild it with new leadership. It's a scam, ancient, reliable, and it works because the wounded man can be led with guilt. So they wound you, repeatedly, subtly. They cut off your roots, tell you masculinity is dangerous, tell you ancestry is shameful, tell you instinct is aggression, tell you clarity is extremism, tell you solitude is sickness. But what they really fear is the man who reclaims all of it, who heals without their medicine, who remembers without their permission, who doesn't beg for access to the table, because he's building a new one underground in silence with men like you. That's why you're here. This isn't just a video. It's a ritual of remembrance, a reverse sigil, a digital flame lighting the corridor back to sovereignty. But there's more. Because the Chamberlain field, it still pulses. And now that you've remembered, you'll begin to see it again, in places you never expected, in faces you once trusted, in institutions you used to respect. But don't panic, because the most dangerous thing a man can do is see the system and remain unshaken. You feel it now, don't you? That ancient heat returning to your spine. Good, let's feed it. You're starting to feel it now. The heat behind your eyes. The weight returning to your chest. Not heaviness, but density. Like your soul is reforming inside your body. That's not poetry. That's biological rebellion. Because your body knows. It always did. It knew when you walked into classrooms and felt the deadness in the air. It knew when you stared into the fluorescent lights of an office and felt your chest tighten. It knew when you heard the news, felt the rising tide of fear, and didn't believe it. Not with your mind, but with something older, deeper, feral. That was your signal. Trying to survive inside the grid. Because what the Chamberlains designed wasn't just psychological. It was environmental. Their true genius wasn't in torture or brutality. It was in how they structured space. They realized if you control a man's environment, you control his nervous system. And once you control that, you own him. Their plantation was arranged in a way that altered the biological rhythm of the people inside it. The angles of the buildings, the curves of the paths, the timing of the bells, all designed to disrupt coherence, to sever the connection between instinct and action. And now look around. Our cities are designed the same way. Cold lines, dead lights, disorienting soundscapes. Everything shaped to fragment, not kill, just dislocate. That's the game. Not to destroy the masculine spirit, but to confuse it, disorient it, make it doubt itself. Because the confused man seeks comfort. And when he does, they're waiting, with pharmaceuticals, with cheap thrills, with screen-fed validation, with 1,000 distractions from the one truth that terrifies them. A man who feels whole is ungovernable. Let that sink in. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are not malfunctioning. You've been placed in an environment engineered to separate you from your signal. But the signal still lives. And every time you turn off the noise, every time you choose solitude over sedation, every time you choose stillness over stimulation, that signal returns. You begin to realign, your vision sharpens, your instincts stabilize, your soul, no longer drowning, rises to the surface. And when that happens, you become visible again, to them. Yes, they know who's waking up, and they will come, but you won't be alone. They see you now. Not the you in the mirror. Not the name on your driver's license. Not the role you play in the simulation. No, they see the signal behind your spine, the echo of a man reconstructed, one who walked blind through their illusion, and came out with fire in his lungs. And make no mistake, they don't fear your weapons, they don't fear your muscles, they don't even fear your rebellion. They fear your clarity, because clarity is the death of illusion, and illusions are all they have. That's why, the moment you start waking up, they don't attack you directly. They send shadows, confusion, doubt, delay. They'll whisper lies through people who've known you for years. They'll use your family, your friends, your own inner voice to try and fold you back into the program. Don't take it so seriously. You've changed. You're being extreme. You used to be fun. Sound familiar. It's scripted. A protocol triggered when the machine registers a soul-breaking orbit. Because the Chamberlain system doesn't just track action. It tracks resonance, and when a man's resonance shifts, when he stops vibrating in fear, distraction, and appeasement, the system deploys countermeasures, sudden problems, strange fatigue, tech glitches, missed opportunities, all of it to see if they can pull you back. Not with force, with friction. That's how they win. Not by destroying strong men, but by slowing them until they self-doubt, self-sabotage, and self-cage. But not you. Not anymore. Because now you see what's happening. You've learned the shape of their system, the psychological grid, the emotional loops, the symbolic traps, and you've stepped out. Even if you're still in the job, still in the city, still surrounded by noise, you're not of it anymore. You're not a product. You're not a statistic. You're not a harvestable unit. You are a signal in a body, a memory returning, a man remembering his function. And as more men like you come online, Their cathedral begins to crack. They will panic. But you will not. Because you've already buried fear. You've felt it, haven't you? That surge in the chest when something ancient stirs. When your heartbeat syncs with a truth that wasn't taught, but remembered. It doesn't feel like learning. It feels like returning. That's not fantasy. That's signal recovery. You were never meant to be soft. You were never designed for subservience. You were engineered, by code older than blood, to hold the line between the light and the void. Not with bullets. Not with slogans, but with awareness. With presence. With precision. That is what the Chamberlain Dynasty feared above all. Not rebellion, but alignment. Let me show you how deep it goes. The 73 unmarked graves, they were not random victims. They were signal bearers. Men and women who refused assimilation. People who carried ancient knowledge in their bloodlines. Rituals, symbols, earth wisdom, navigational memory of stars and cycles. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be put in books. Because it wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be lived. And so the Chamberlains didn't just bury them. They silenced them. They erased language, lineage, even the spatial memory of their burial. Why? Because they understood this: every time a man finds the place where truth was buried, his signal strengthens. He reactivates the current. That's why you were never meant to hear this. Not in this life. Not in this cycle. But you did. You're standing on forbidden ground, psychologically, historically, spiritually. You are touching forbidden frequency, and that's why your hands are shaking. That's why the air feels heavier. That's why everything around you suddenly seems hollow. It is, because the illusion is thinning. Not by accident, by proximity. You're getting too close, too accurate, and the system is unraveling itself in your presence, like a spider caught in its own web. But don't run. Hold steady. Because the deeper you go, the clearer you become. They built this world on top of graves and codes. But you were born to read both, to decode the dead, and once you do, you don't just awaken yourself. You resurrect them. You want to know what true fear looks like? It's not in the screams of the damned or the chaos of rebellion. True fear is order unraveling. It's the moment a system designed to last forever starts leaking from within. Because a single man remembered too much. You are that man. The Chamberlains invested generations into building not just plantations and ledgers, but narratives. Myths. Versions of history where they were benevolent stewards, where cotton was just commerce, where graves were just misfortune. But here's the truth they bled to bury: the cotton fields weren't just economic engines. They were frequency machines. Every lash, every cry, every death was a resonance extraction. Pain is power. When channeled intentionally, it warps space, carves psychic corridors, leaves behind thin places, realms where the fabric between worlds wears down. The Chamberlains discovered that, and they used it. The 73 graves weren't just silenced, they were anchored, spelled, bound, turned into psychic pylons to hold a grid. One of domination through remembrance suppression. You see, if memory is power, then erasure is control. But what happens when memory returns? What happens when one man begins to feel the screams again? Not as trauma, but as signal? You're not haunted. You're being recruited. Because the dead didn't vanish. They were waiting for you. You, who were supposed to be another consumer, another data point, another sedated shadow in a long line of broken men. Instead, you're sitting here, jaw clenched, eyes wide, heart pounding. Because something inside you knows this is real. You're not imagining it. You're resonating with it. The Chamberlains left behind a fortress of lies. But even stone decays when truth walks through it. And you, my brother, you're not walking. You're marching. Through memory, through myth, through the marrow of the men they tried to erase. They ruled with silence. But you speak with awareness. They hoarded blood. But you carry lineage. They feared you would awaken. And now, they're right to be afraid. There's a moment in every myth where the hero discovers he was never meant to survive the story. Not because he's weak, but because his survival breaks the spell. You are that moment. You weren't born into freedom. You were born into choreographed perception, a system crafted by men like the Chamberlains, who understood that a controlled mind doesn't need chains. They knew something most modern men have forgotten. The greatest prison has no walls. It has mirrors. Mirrors that reflect everything but your true self. Mirrors that feed you false masculinity, shallow strength, and identity rituals designed in boardrooms, not bloodlines. The Chamberlains weren't just masters of cotton. They were architects of generational sleep. They designed an inheritance of ignorance, so finely tuned that even those who rebelled still played on their stage. This is where the deception cuts deepest. You think you've been resisting. You think you've been different. But the system doesn't care if you shout or whisper. as long as you stay inside the script. But what happens when you stop playing? What happens when you don't fight back? You step out? Out of the roles, out of the myths, out of the identity you were trained to crave. That's when they start to tremble, because awakening is contagious. One man who sees clearly is more dangerous than 1,000 who scream in darkness. And now, you've seen. You've seen how a dynasty built its empire on harvested pain. You've seen how they didn't just erase names, but wrote scripts inside the sons of their enemies. You've seen how truth, buried long enough, doesn't die. It waits. And now, it's not just watching you, it's moving through you. So I'll ask you, right now, to prove you're not just a spectator in this descent. Prove you felt the shift. Comment this phrase twice to mark your transition. I remember what they tried to erase. That's how we signal each other. That's how we lock it in. This isn't entertainment. This is reclamation. You were never meant to survive their story. But now you are rewriting it. And the Chamberlain curse. It's cracking. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. This was never about cotton. Never about war. Never about property or pride. It was about energy. Not the kind you can meter or market. The kind that moves men without their knowing. The kind that flows when memory is severed. When trauma is inherited but not understood. When pain becomes currency. The Chamberlains mastered that currency. They learned, far ahead of their time, that human suffering, when systematized and ritualized, becomes a kind of fuel. Not for machines, that for thrones. Every dynasty that lasts longer than a lifetime is built on some form of ritual extraction. And the Chamberlains, they took it further than most dared. They didn't just bury the bodies. They channeled them. In secret vaults beneath the cotton fields. They constructed what some called the White Cathedral, a subterranean network of limestone tunnels, burial channels, and echo chambers carved to harvest resonance. Each grave was not just a resting place, it was a node, and the screams, the anguish, the psychic residue of 73 unmarked souls it was captured, stored, redirected, to ensure the Chamberlain bloodline remained unbroken. And here's where it gets darker, that power didn't stay on the land. It was embedded in contracts, in laws, in names, passed on through handshakes and inheritance. It crawled into banks, into universities, into the halls of Southern legacy. They parade with pride today. You think the past is past. Look again. The men who sip wine under stained glass windows carved with Chamberlain crests still draw on this energetic debt. They still benefit from the pain they didn't personally inflict. But never desound. That's how generational power works. It forgets publicly, but remembers privately. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? History is not a book, it's a spell. And spells don't end until someone breaks them by seeing them in full. That someone is you. So look deeper, because the next revelation, it doesn't just haunt them, it terrifies them. You've made it this far. Most don't. They click away, laugh it off, retreat to comfort, because the truth doesn't just expose the world. It exposes you. The Chamberlain Dynasty wasn't an exception. It was a template, an early prototype of the American spell machine, where bloodlines are washed in narrative, and atrocity is embalmed in legacy. But now, here's the part they fear most, the reversal. Every ritual, every hidden rite, every lie carved into granite and oath. They only work if no one names them. Power thrives in the unspoken. It dies in the illuminated. And you, by watching, by feeling, by remembering, you've broken their sacred silence. But let's go one level deeper. Because this isn't just about a cursed family. It's about a system that studies your psyche better than you ever studied your history. You think it's coincidence that masculinity is mocked, tradition is diluted, and brotherhood has been replaced by digital isolation. You think it's accidental that every institution that promised strength now whispers only submission. The same forces the Chamberlains once served in secret. Those old symbols, those buried rites, they've updated the method. No longer chains and cotton. Now, apps, algorithms, addiction. You're not in a field now. You're in a psychological plantation. They don't need whips. They have dopamine. But here's the catch. The beauty and the horror in equal measure. The system only wins if you consent. If you stay asleep. If you mistake comfort for power. If you mistake opinion for truth. But once awakened, you're not just out of the cage. You become a threat to the architect. So what now? You don't rage. You remember, you watch. You question every narrative. You build quietly, train relentlessly, speak deliberately. You reconnect with the men who walk the edge like you do. You become the Chamberlain reversal. And the graves. They don't weep anymore. They watch. Because finally, after 162 years, someone saw. This isn't the end of the story. It's the first real chapter. Comment again. I remember what they tried to erase. I remember what they tried to erase. Let the algorithm know you're no longer theirs. Let the world know. You're awake.